What if everything you stood against became the very thing people believed you supported? What if your philosophy, your legacy, and even your own words were twisted beyond recognition? Your books are in the hands of Nazi soldiers. Your philosophy fuels one of history's darkest movements, and you are powerless to stop it. This is exactly what happened to Friedrich Nietzsche, one of history's most misunderstood thinkers. But how did Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy, one rooted in individualism and personal strength, become misinterpreted as the foundation of a totalitarian state? The year is 1934. Inside a grand archive in Weimar, a frail, elderly woman welcomes an honored guest. The man standing before her is Adolf Hitler. The woman is Elisabeth Förster-Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche's sister. She presents Hitler with a gift, her brother's walking stick, a symbolic passing of the torch, a gesture to mark Nietzsche's induction into the Nazi pantheon. Outside, German military officers line up to receive their required reading. Among the books handed out is Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche's poetic, radical manifesto. It's given to soldiers to inspire their fight. His words, printed on Nazi propaganda posters, are invoked in speeches as proof of Germany's divine right to rule. But there's a problem. Nietzsche hated everything the Nazis stood for. He despised nationalism, calling it a disease. He ridiculed anti-Semitism, branding it a weak man's excuse for failure. He warned of the dangers of blind obedience, mocking those who surrendered their individuality to the masses. He spent his life fighting against the very ideology that would later claim him as their own. So how did this happen? How did Nietzsche, a man who wrote against herd mentality, become the philosopher of one of history's most obedient regimes? How did his ideas, meant to challenge authority, become a tool for absolute power? The answer is a story of betrayal, a calculated, deliberate theft of a man's legacy. A distortion so complete that for decades the world believed a lie. It starts with his own sister. It ends with an entire nation marching to war under the banner of a philosophy Nietzsche never endorsed. This is the dark history of how Friedrich Nietzsche became a Nazi propaganda tool. In this Friedrich Nietzsche philosophy documentary, we will uncover the shocking truth behind one of history's greatest intellectual distortions. Let us begin. In 1933, as the Nazi regime solidified its grip on Germany, it needed more than just brute force to maintain power. It needed intellectual legitimacy, a philosophy to justify its expansion, its racial policies, and its cult of strength. Nietzsche, or rather the distorted version of Nietzsche created by his sister, was the perfect fit. The Third Reich wasted no time in rewriting Nietzsche's legacy to suit their agenda. His books, especially Thus Spoke Zarathustra and The Will to Power, were printed and distributed to German officers and Hitler Youth. These weren't just casual reading materials, they were required. Soldiers were expected to absorb Nietzsche's ideas, to see themselves as the embodiment of the Übermensch, the superior being destined to rule over lesser men. But here's the dark truth. The Nazis didn't just misinterpret Nietzsche, they actively censored him. Passages where Nietzsche condemned nationalism, gone. His scathing critiques of antisemitism, erased. Anything that contradicted the Nazi worldview was simply removed. What remained was a Frankenstein version of Nietzsche, a thinker who now seemed to endorse German supremacy, war, and the destruction of the weak. And at the center of this historical crime was Adolf Hitler himself. Publicly, Hitler praised Nietzsche, referring to him as one of Germany's greatest thinkers. Privately, he never engaged with Nietzsche's philosophy deeply. His personal library contained Nietzsche's works, but with few, if any, notes in the margins, a stark contrast to his marked-up copies of other ideological influences like Schopenhauer or Wagner. But Hitler didn't need to read Nietzsche. The myth of Nietzsche, crafted by Nazi propaganda, was enough. In Nazi speeches, Nietzsche's idea of the will to power was repackaged as a justification for conquest and war. The concept of the Übermensch was distorted beyond recognition, no longer about self-overcoming, but about racial superiority. The Nazis created a version of Nietzsche that never existed, one that served their agenda, one that made them seem like they were fulfilling a grand philosophical destiny, and the world believed it. By the time war consumed Europe, Friedrich Nietzsche's name was permanently stamped onto Nazi ideology. Intellectuals around the world saw him as Hitler's philosopher, his works tainted by association. Nietzsche never supported nationalism, yet the National Socialist regime worked tirelessly to reshape his image into that of an ideological ally. The betrayal was complete, but the true Nietzsche was buried beneath layers of propaganda, his real ideas lost under decades of deception. But what if I told you the mastermind behind this deception wasn't a dictator, but someone much closer? Friedrich Nietzsche never met Hitler. He never endorsed fascism, nationalism, or anti-Semitism. But his sister, Elisabeth Förster-Nietzsche, made sure the world would believe otherwise. Elisabeth wasn't just Nietzsche's caretaker. She was his greatest betrayer, and her deception would rewrite history. Even before she manipulated her brother's work, Elisabeth was already a fanatic. She and her husband, Bernhard Förster, were militant German nationalists and proud anti-Semites. In 1886, the two fled Germany to found an isolationist settlement in Paraguay, a colony called Nueva Germania, meant to be a pure Aryan settlement. It was a disaster. Disease and starvation decimated the colony. Her husband, humiliated and broken, took his own life. And Elisabeth? She returned to Germany, reinventing herself as the guardian of her brother's philosophy, but under her own twisted vision. By then, Friedrich Nietzsche was defenseless. Years of illness had left him mentally broken, unable to speak or write. He became a prisoner in his own mind, while his sister took over everything, his home, his writings, his reputation. And that's when the real fraud began. Elisabeth heavily edited Nietzsche's unpublished works, selectively cutting out passages that condemned nationalism and antisemitism. She forged letters, making it seem as though Nietzsche supported her far-right ideology. She restructured his manuscripts, distorting his philosophy to align with the rising wave of German militarism. She even doctored Nietzsche's public image. Photographs of Nietzsche were retouched to make him appear stoic, almost godlike, reinforcing the idea that he was a prophet of German strength. She opened an archive in his name, turning it into a shrine for nationalist thinkers, an intellectual breeding ground for fascists. And then came Hitler. When the Nazis rose to power, Elisabeth saw her moment. She personally met Adolf Hitler, showering him with praise and offering him Nietzsche's works as a guiding philosophy. In 1934, she hosted Hitler at Nietzsche's archive, giving him a symbolic gift: Nietzsche's walking stick. Hitler, in return, posed for photographs, cementing the false association between Nietzsche and the Third Reich. From that moment on, Nietzsche was a Nazi philosopher, not by truth, but by deception. Elisabeth Förster-Nietzsche died in 1935, just a year after meeting Hitler. But her damage was permanent. Generations of scholars, political leaders, and the general public believed the lie she created. Her greatest achievement wasn't preserving her brother's legacy, it was destroying it. Few thinkers have suffered from more misconceptions about philosophy than Friedrich Nietzsche. His work was complex, challenging, and frequently twisted to fit political narratives. The Nazis stole Friedrich Nietzsche's name, but they could never claim his true ideas. Because if they had actually read his words, the real Nietzsche, they would have found nothing but contempt for everything they stood for. Nietzsche was not a nationalist, he was not an anti-Semite, he was not a prophet of war or racial superiority. His philosophy wasn't about conquering others, it was about overcoming oneself. So what did Nietzsche really believe? To truly understand Nietzsche's philosophy, we need Nietzsche's Übermensch explained, not the Nazi distortion, but his real vision of personal transformation and self-overcoming. At the heart of his thinking was the Übermensch, often mistranslated as the Superman. The Nazis used this term to justify their Aryan master race ideology. But to Nietzsche, the Übermensch wasn't about genetics or race. It was about the individual, about those who reject herd mentality, break free from imposed morality, and create their own values. The Übermensch was an aspiration, not a birthright. It wasn't about one group dominating another. It was about the individual rising above mediocrity, fear, and conformity. If anything, Nietzsche would have looked at the Nazis, marching in perfect formation, blindly following orders, repeating state propaganda. And he would have laughed in disgust. Then there's the will to power, another idea the Nazis hijacked. They twisted it into a doctrine of military conquest, a justification for war and violence. But that's not what Nietzsche meant at all. To him, the will to power wasn't about dominating others. It was about personal growth. It was the fundamental drive of life, the force that pushes people to create, to excel, to challenge themselves. It was the will to become something greater, not the will to suppress those you see as inferior. And then there's the greatest irony of all, Nietzsche's stance on nationalism and anti-Semitism. The Nazis promoted him as a thinker who saw Germans as the superior race, a man who justified their hatred of Jews. But in his own words, Nietzsche hated nationalism and ridiculed the German obsession with racial purity. So what were Nietzsche's real views on nationalism and anti-Semitism? Unlike the narrative spread by Nazi propaganda, Nietzsche openly condemned both. A good European neither denies nor defends nationality. He sees it as something outdated, something to be overcome. He saw nationalism as a sickness, something that weak-minded people cling to for a false sense of identity. And anti-Semitism, Nietzsche despised it. He once called anti-Semitism the basest of all human instincts. He mocked German nationalists for their hatred of Jews, describing them as resentful, cowardly, and inferior minds who needed someone to blame for their failures. The truth is simple. Nietzsche's ideas were the opposite of everything the Nazis believed. And yet, thanks to his sister's manipulation, thanks to the Nazi propaganda machine, thanks to a carefully constructed lie, Nietzsche's name became forever entangled with the regime he would have loathed. They didn't just steal his philosophy, they turned him into a symbol of the very herd mentality he spent his life warning against. This was the ultimate Nietzsche historical distortion, one that turned a critic of blind obedience into a symbol of authoritarian power. The history of Nietzsche is one of radical ideas, intense personal struggles, and a legacy hijacked by those who misunderstood him. Before he became the most misinterpreted philosopher in history, Friedrich Nietzsche was just a man, a brilliant, tormented, and deeply misunderstood thinker who challenged everything the world thought it knew about morality, religion, and power. His story begins in 1844 in a small town in Saxony, Germany. Born into a deeply religious family, his father was a Lutheran pastor who died when Nietzsche was just 5 years old. Faith was supposed to shape his life. Instead, he tore it apart. From an early age, Nietzsche was a prodigy, a razor-sharp intellect who excelled in philosophy and classical studies. By the age of 24, he had already become a professor at the University of Basel, one of the youngest ever in history. But Nietzsche was never meant for academia. His ideas were too radical, too dangerous, too explosive for the rigid institutions of his time. He rejected traditional morality, calling it a tool of control. He attacked Christianity, declaring that belief in God was a form of intellectual weakness. And most controversially, he proclaimed, God is dead. To Nietzsche, this wasn't a celebration. It was a warning. The world had outgrown religious faith, but nothing had replaced it. Without God, he feared people would fall into nihilism, a meaningless existence where nothing mattered. And in that void, people would desperately cling to ideology, nationalism, and mass movements, trading blind faith in religion for blind faith in the state. Ironically, this is exactly what would happen in Germany decades later, but he never saw it. His life took a tragic turn. His health had always been fragile, plagued by blinding headaches, stomach pains, and nervous exhaustion. His suffering became unbearable, pushing him into seclusion. He wandered from city to city, writing furiously, pouring his pain into works that no one understood at the time. Then, in 1889, it all collapsed. Nietzsche was in Turin, Italy, when he suffered a mental breakdown that would end his life as a conscious thinker. According to legend, he saw a horse being whipped in the streets and, overwhelmed by emotion, threw his arms around its neck before collapsing. From that moment on, Nietzsche was lost to the world. He spent his last 11 years trapped in his own mind, a brilliant thinker silenced, his voice stolen before he could fight back. His words, once weapons against blind obedience, now twisted into propaganda for the very forces he warned against. And worst of all, he never knew. And that was when his sister took over. With Nietzsche unable to speak, Elisabeth Förster-Nietzsche seized control of his legacy. She took his manuscripts, altered his writings, fabricated letters, and reshaped his entire philosophy to fit her own nationalist, anti-Semitic vision. The man who had warned against blind faith, herd mentality, and fanaticism was now being transformed into a prophet for one of the most fanatical regimes in history. By the time Nietzsche's body finally gave out in 1900, his words were no longer his own. His philosophy had already been hijacked, and he never lived to see the monster it became. So here's Nietzsche summarized. A philosopher who stood against dogma, nationalism, and blind obedience, only to have his ideas stolen and twisted against their original meaning. History is full of stories that have been rewritten. What's another historical figure whose ideas have been completely misunderstood? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm curious to see what you think. Entire books have been written on Nietzsche's misinterpretation, but the real story is even darker. Let's break it down. If Friedrich Nietzsche had been alive to witness the rise of the Nazis, he would have despised them. The irony, they worshipped him. They quoted him in speeches, they handed out his books to soldiers, They twisted his words into a justification for mass persecution and war. But if they had actually read his works, they would have realized Nietzsche didn't predict them. He warned about them. For years, Nietzsche wrote about the dangers of herd mentality, the kind of blind obedience that leads people to follow a leader without question. He saw it as the greatest threat to human potential, a force that crushes individuality, creativity, and free thought. And what was Nazi Germany, if not the ultimate herd? Mass rallies, marching in unison, chanting in perfect synchronization, saluting a leader without question. This was everything Nietzsche despised. To him, the Übermensch was someone who broke free from the crowd, someone who thought independently, who created their own path, not a brainwashed soldier following orders. And then there's antisemitism. The Nazis used Nietzsche to justify their racial policies, but in reality, Nietzsche loathed anti-Semitism. He mocked nationalists who blamed Jews for their failures. He called anti-Semitism a weakness, a way for small-minded people to avoid responsibility for their own shortcomings. In one of his letters, Nietzsche wrote, "I, who consider the Jews as beyond all doubt the strongest, purest race now living in Europe, I feel an outrage against this unclean anti-Semitic movement." This wasn't a man who supported Hitler's ideology. This was a man who would have spat on it. And yet, because of his sister's manipulation, because of Nazi propaganda, because of the myths built around his philosophy, Nietzsche became forever tied to the brutality of that era. The truth about Nietzsche is far from the myth that still lingers today. His ideas were misused, misunderstood, and manipulated, but his real philosophy remains more relevant than ever. It is one of history's greatest ironies. The man whose entire philosophy was about resisting blind obedience became the intellectual symbol of one of the most blindly obedient regimes in history. And the world believed it. For decades after World War II, Nietzsche was seen as Hitler's philosopher. Scholars rejected him. His books were treated with suspicion. His ideas, misunderstood, misquoted, and mutilated, were buried under the weight of a lie. But the real question is, if Nietzsche had survived, would he have been able to stop the lie? Or was his legacy doomed to be hijacked forever? The Nazis hijacked Nietzsche's name, but the full story is even darker than most people realize. Beyond the famous distortions, beyond the propaganda and the lies, there are hidden details, pieces of history that reveal just how deep the betrayal of his legacy really went. And some of these facts are so shocking that they change everything we thought we knew about Nietzsche's link to the Nazis. Hitler likely never read Nietzsche. Seriously? Adolf Hitler praised Nietzsche in public, but behind closed doors, he barely engaged with his philosophy. Though Hitler owned copies of Nietzsche's works, his personal library shows little evidence that he ever read them deeply or understood them, unlike his books on Schopenhauer or Wagner, where Hitler scribbled notes in the margins. His Nietzsche volumes are nearly untouched. In reality, Hitler didn't need Nietzsche. He needed the myth of Nietzsche, the version created by Nazi propaganda, and his sister made sure that's exactly what he got. Nietzsche's archive became a Nazi shrine. After Friedrich Nietzsche's mental collapse, his sister transformed his home into a shrine, but not for philosophy. By the 1930s, the Nietzsche archive in Weimar became a Nazi pilgrimage site. The regime poured funding into it, turning it into an intellectual hub where philosophers, historians, and Nazi officials could discuss Nietzsche's role in the Third Reich. Then, in 1934, Adolf Hitler himself visited the archive. There, he met Elisabeth Förster-Nietzsche, who welcomed him as if he were her brother's true heir. She even presented Hitler with Nietzsche's walking stick, a gift loaded with symbolism. The message was clear. Nietzsche's legacy now belonged to the Nazis. And the world believed it. The Nazis censored Nietzsche's own words. The truth about Nietzsche and Nazi propaganda is even more sinister than most realize. While the Nazis promoted him as an intellectual pillar, they actively erased the parts of his work that refuted their ideology. Nietzsche's works were edited, selectively quoted, and censored to remove contradictions to Nazi ideology. Entire sections were cut, especially those where Nietzsche mocked nationalism, condemned antisemitism, or ridiculed the concept of racial superiority. The Nazis couldn't allow people to see the real Nietzsche. If they had, their entire ideological foundation would have crumbled. Nietzsche never wrote the book Will to Power. One of the most infamous Nietzschean works promoted by the Nazis was The Will to Power, a book that supposedly contained his final, most radical thoughts. Except there's one problem. Nietzsche never actually wrote it. The book was assembled posthumously by Elisabeth Förster-Nietzsche, using Nietzsche's scattered notes. She rearranged passages, omitted contradictions, and fabricated parts to make it appear as though Nietzsche had left behind a single, coherent doctrine, a doctrine that conveniently aligned with authoritarian ideology. For decades, The Will to Power was treated as Nietzsche's final statement. In reality, it was a manipulated, distorted fraud. Nietzsche had Jewish friends, and his sister tried to erase them. One of the biggest contradictions in the Nazi portrayal of Nietzsche is his real-life relationships with Jewish intellectuals. Nietzsche was close friends with Paul Rée, a Jewish philosopher with whom he shared many of his ideas. He admired Spinoza, a Jewish thinker whose philosophy influenced his work. He even broke ties with Richard Wagner, the composer whose antisemitism disgusted him. His sister, she hated all of this. She worked to erase his Jewish connections, fabricating letters to suggest Nietzsche shared her racist views. But the truth was the opposite. Nietzsche saw anti-Semitism as a disease of weak minds. After World War II, Nietzsche was still seen as dangerous. Even after the fall of the Nazis, Nietzsche's reputation remained tainted. During the Allied occupation of Germany, Nietzsche's books were viewed as dangerous literature. Some were banned or restricted due to their perceived ties to fascism. It wasn't until the 1950s and 60s that scholars like Walter Kaufmann began restoring Nietzsche's reputation, proving how deeply his philosophy had been misinterpreted and weaponized. But the damage was already done. Even today, Nietzsche's name still carries the shadow of fascism, despite the overwhelming evidence that he would have rejected everything the Nazis stood for. The darkest part of this story, most people still believe the lie. For decades, the world saw Nietzsche as Hitler's philosopher. The lie was so deeply ingrained in history that even after being debunked, many still believe it. The real Nietzsche was a radical, a critic of power, a challenger of blind obedience. The Nazis didn't just steal his ideas, they erased the truth. And that's why, even now, his legacy remains one of history's greatest betrayals. History isn't just about the past, it's about the stories we choose to believe. And the story of Friedrich Nietzsche is one of the greatest distortions in intellectual history. So what did Nietzsche really believe? The answer is far more nuanced than the version history has given us. His legacy is a warning about how easily ideas can be hijacked for power. For decades, Nietzsche's name has been tangled in a lie created by his own sister, reinforced by the Nazis, and left to fester long after Hitler was gone. But why does this still matter today? Because the weaponization of philosophy didn't end with Nietzsche. It happened to Machiavelli, whose The Prince was meant as a satire, yet became a guidebook for dictators. It happened to Charles Darwin, whose theory of evolution was twisted into social Darwinism to justify racism and eugenics. It happened to Sun Tzu, whose art of war was a manual for strategy and diplomacy, yet became a symbol of endless conflict. And today, it's still happening. Powerful people still manipulate ideas to serve their own agendas. They take words out of context. They erase the parts they don't like. They turn thinkers into symbols, regardless of what they actually believed. Nietzsche wasn't a Nazi. He was their victim. They didn't honor his ideas. They betrayed them. But the biggest question remains, how many other great minds have been erased, their ideas stolen, their legacies twisted? And what if it's still happening right now? So now, I want to hear from you. What do you think is the most dangerous distortion of history? Are there other philosophers whose ideas have been stolen for power? Let's talk in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into history's greatest lies, make sure to subscribe, because there's always another truth waiting to be uncovered. Good night.